My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 68 years old, and I am a white British woman who has spent most of her life believing that the weight of motherhood was a sacred duty I was born to carry. I raised my son Daniel almost entirely on my own after his father left when Daniel was still learning to walk, and for decades my life revolved around making sure he never felt the absence that I felt so deeply. I worked as a bookkeeper by day and took extra shifts in the evenings, sometimes skipping my own meals so he could have his, patching up his school uniforms when I could not afford new ones, and staying up into the early hours to help him revise for exams. I never kept count of the sacrifices, because love, to me, was not something you measured like coins in a jar. That morning, the kettle whistled on the stove in my small, sunlit kitchen, steam curling into the air like soft ribbons, and the smell of toast lingered in the air. I had called Daniel the day before to ask if he might help me fix a leak under the sink, the kind that leaves a steady, mocking drip in the night. It was not a large job, but my hands ache these days, and crouching for too long makes my knees burn. I expected perhaps a sigh or a joke about my old plumbing, but instead his voice carried an edge I had not heard before. "Mum, you have to stop being a burden," he said, each word slow and deliberate, as though he wanted them to lodge in my chest. I remember holding the phone in my hand and feeling the sting travel from my ear to my ribs, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through places I thought had long healed. A burden. I had been called many things in my life, some whispered in pity, others shouted in anger, but never by my own child, never in a tone that suggested my existence had shifted from cherished to inconvenient. I leaned against the counter, the laminate cool under my palm, and stared at the worn tea towel hanging from the oven handle, its once bright pattern faded from years of use. My mind wandered unbidden to the nights I sat in the cold, waiting for him to come home from university so I could hear about his day, to the mornings I pressed his shirts for job interviews, to the afternoons I sent money I barely had when he was short on rent. His words did not just hurt. They rearranged something inside me, pulling apart the delicate threads of identity that had been woven through decades of motherhood. I heard him still speaking, his tone moving on to something casual, as if he had not just planted a seed of cold in my chest. I made some excuse to hang up, my voice calm, though my heart felt bruised, and I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to that steady drip under the sink, each drop keeping time with the truth I could no longer ignore. I was 29 when my marriage ended, a crisp winter morning when the papers were signed and the air outside felt sharper than the words exchanged in that courthouse. Daniel was barely 2 years old, his cheeks round and pink from the cold, too young to understand why his father's shadow no longer lingered in the doorway. From that day forward, it was just the two of us against the world, and I wore the role of both mother and father like a second skin. I worked as a bookkeeper during the day in a drafty office where the radiators rarely worked, and in the evenings I took whatever extra shifts I could find, typing up ledgers for small businesses or cleaning holiday lets for neighbours who trusted my careful hands. There were nights when dinner for me was a crust of bread and a cup of tea so Daniel could have a full plate, and winters when I layered 2 jumpers under my coat so the heating could stay on for him while he slept. I learned how to stretch every pound until it groaned, how to patch school trousers so neatly you'd think they were new, how to smile when there was nothing left in my purse but bus fare. Every milestone he reached felt like a victory for both of us. His first sports day where he ran in shoes I had found at a second-hand shop, the afternoons he brought home certificates with gold stars, the acceptance letter to university that I read and reread with tears in my eyes. I remember the day I paid his first term's tuition, my hands shaking as I transferred the money, knowing it was the savings I had built over years of quiet self-denial, but feeling nothing but pride at what it meant for him. Even when he called from his tiny flat in the city, asking for a bit more to cover rent or books, I never hesitated, though sometimes it meant working late into the night or selling something I loved to make it happen. When he graduated, wearing that cap and gown that made him look taller than he was, my heart swelled with a pride so fierce it felt like light pouring through every seam in me. I told myself all the struggles, the empty stomachs, the aching feet, the quiet tears shed behind closed doors, were worth it because he would have the kind of life I had never known. I built my world around the belief that my sacrifices were an investment in his future, that the love I poured into every choice would return in the form of his happiness. Back then, I never questioned that he saw it too, that somewhere deep down he carried the memory of those years in the same tender place I did, and that he understood I had given him everything I could, and more than I had. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you might dismiss as the natural drift that comes when a man marries and builds his own life. But I began to hear it in Daniel's voice not long after he married Marla. There was a new stiffness in his tone, like a curtain quietly drawn between us, and although his words were still polite, the warmth that used to spill so easily through the phone began to thin. Marla was younger than Daniel by a few years, with a quick wit that could turn sharp without warning, and a way of speaking to me that left me feeling as if I had been politely pushed to the edge of the room. At the wedding, she had been gracious enough, though I caught her watching me with a faintly amused expression when I offered to help clear the tables, as if kindness from me was something to be humoured rather than accepted. In the months that followed, the calls that used to wander lazily through our days grew brisk, clipped at the edges, often ending with him saying they had somewhere to be. Visits became infrequent, and when they did come by, I noticed how Marla steered the conversation, deciding what was worth discussing and what was not. I would learn about holidays they had taken after they returned, trips I had not even known they were planning, and I began to realize they were making decisions that once would have been shared with me without a second thought. It was not that I expected to be consulted on everything, but the exclusion settled over me like a thin layer of frost, leaving a chill I could not quite shake. Once, Daniel mentioned in passing that they had bought a new car, something he would once have called me about the moment they signed the papers, and I smiled and congratulated him even as a small part of me felt the door close a little more. There were family gatherings with Marla's relatives that I was not invited to, photographs of which would appear on their mantle or online, and I would study them in quiet moments, tracing Daniel's smile and wondering if he noticed the gap that was growing between us. I told myself it was just the natural shift of priorities, that marriage had given him a new center of gravity. But the truth was more painful. It was as if my place in his life had been redrawn in faint pencil, easily erased when more pressing matters filled the space. The boy who once ran to me with news of every small triumph now spoke to me in measured sentences, his attention elsewhere. And I began to understand that something fundamental had shifted, and it was not moving back in my direction. The evening had started with the kind of polite formality that makes you feel like a guest in a stranger's home rather than a mother visiting her son. The table set neatly in Marla's cool, modern dining room, the silverware lined like soldiers waiting for inspection. I had brought a bottle of wine I could barely afford, hoping it might soften whatever invisible wall had been rising between us. And Daniel greeted me with a quick hug that felt rehearsed, his eyes darting toward Marla as if seeking approval. We sat down, the three of us, and for a moment I thought perhaps it would be pleasant, but as the meal unfolded, the air grew taut. Marla served roasted chicken and vegetables, her conversation flowing easily when she spoke of her family's holiday plans or a new project at work. Yet every time I tried to contribute, her replies were smooth and clipped, the kind that close a door without making a sound. Then, somewhere between the main course and dessert, she leaned back in her chair, her tone light, but her eyes sharp, and said, "It's a shame when people don't plan properly for retirement. It puts such a strain on their loved ones." The words hung in the air, thinly veiled and heavy at the same time, and Daniel kept his gaze fixed on his plate, cutting a piece of chicken into small, precise bites, as though he could disappear into the act. I felt my cheeks grow warm, not from guilt, but from the quiet humiliation of knowing exactly who she meant. I had worked my whole life, raised Daniel on my own without help, and while my savings were modest, I had never asked for more than the occasional hand with repairs or errands I could no longer manage. Yet here I was, sitting across from my own son's wife, being spoken about as though I were a cautionary tale. I tried to swallow the lump rising in my throat and managed a small, polite smile, telling myself not to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur, Marla chatting about renovations they were considering for the house, Daniel nodding along, the conversation moving as if I were not even there. I sipped my wine slowly, my mind drifting to the years I had spent making sure Daniel never felt small or excluded, the countless meals where I hung on his every word, the birthdays I scraped together money to make special. Now I sat at his table, an afterthought in the family I had built with my own 2 hands, my voice folding in on itself until I could barely hear it. When dessert came, a tart with a glossy sheen, I took a bite and tasted nothing. By the time I left that night, my smile was fixed, but my heart knew something had changed, and the quiet between us had taken on a weight that would not lift. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds hung low and heavy over the rooftops, pressing the light into something muted and grey, when I finally decided to call Daniel about the leak under my kitchen sink. The drip had been steady for weeks, a small but persistent reminder that some tasks had begun to slip out of my reach, the kind that once I would have tackled with a wrench and a bit of stubbornness. I dialed his number with the quiet hope that he might hear the weariness in my voice and offer to come by, the way he used to when he was younger and his hands were quick to help. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice tight, as if I had interrupted something important. I explained the situation, trying to make it sound like a small favor, nothing urgent, just a quick fix that would mean the world to me. There was a pause, then a sigh that seemed to stretch on longer than it should, and he said, almost under his breath, "Mum, this is because you didn't plan properly. You can't just keep relying on me for things like this." I opened my mouth to reply, to remind him that I had spent decades planning for everything except growing old alone. But before I could form the words, he added, clear and deliberate, "You need to stop being a burden." The sentence landed like a slap, sharp and hot, and for a moment I simply sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling the air drain out of the room. I managed to murmur something about understanding, my voice so calm it surprised me, and then I ended the call before he could say anything else that might lodge itself deeper. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the worn tea towel draped over the oven handle, the sound of the dripping tap filling the silence like a metronome keeping time with my thoughts. Humiliation pooled in my chest, but beneath it, something else stirred, a faint and unfamiliar clarity. For years I had told myself that the changes in Daniel were just the way life moved, that I should not take his distance to heart. But in that moment, I understood that it was more than drift. It was a reshaping, a quiet erasure of the place I once held in his life. I made tea without tasting it, my hands moving through the motions on autopilot, And as I carried the mug to the table, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked smaller somehow, not just in stature, but in the way my shoulders curved inward, as if I had been folding myself down for years to fit into the space he now offered me. That day, for the first time, I realized I had been avoiding the truth, and it had finally found me. That night, long after the street outside had gone still, and the only sound in the house was the faint hum of the refrigerator, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, the kind of plain blue biro that leaves a faint indentation on the paper even when the ink runs dry. I had made myself a pot of tea, but it had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. My focus fixed on the slow, deliberate act of taking stock of my life. It was easy, in moments like the one I had just lived through with Daniel, to believe the story that I was slipping into uselessness, that the years had stripped me of value beyond the sentimental. But when I began to write, a different truth emerged. I wrote down the facts first, as if they were numbers in one of the ledgers I had spent my working life balancing. A modest pension that arrives on time each month, enough to keep the lights on and the cupboards stocked. A small, tidy home that is mine outright, every brick and beam paid for through decades of discipline. A little savings account that I have guarded fiercely, even if it has grown more slowly than I once hoped. Then I listed the less tangible things, the assets that never appear on a bank statement but matter just as much. The ability to stretch a pound until its size, to make a meal out of scraps, to keep a house in good repair with my own 2 hands when I must. I thought of the garden out back, the way the soil still yields to me in spring, and the fact that even now I can hang a line of washing so neatly that the neighbours have commented on it. I wrote the word resilience in the margin and let my pen hover over it for a moment, because it was not a word I had ever claimed for myself before, yet it fit like a key in a familiar lock. I realized I had been measuring my worth by the wrong yardstick, seeing myself only through the narrow lens of what I could no longer do, rather than the breadth of what I still could. Yes, the years had softened my edges and slowed my steps, but they had also sharpened my mind, honed my patience, and given me a kind of quiet strength that does not falter easily. I sat back in my chair and looked around my little kitchen. The scuffed skirting boards, the curtains I had sewn myself, the clock that had been ticking above the stove for 20 years, and I felt a small, stubborn warmth take root inside me. I was not powerless. I had simply been forgetting where my power lay, and now that I had taken the time to see it clearly, I knew it was mine to use however I chose. When I rang Eleanor to ask if she might have time for tea, I did not mention that what I really wanted was her mind, sharp as cut glass even in retirement, turned toward a problem I could no longer ignore. We met at a small cafe, tucked between the butcher's and the post office, the kind of place where the tables wobble slightly and the coffee cups are never quite matched. And when she arrived, wrapped in her favorite camel coat, her eyes scanned me with the quiet precision of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the truth behind people's words. Over our first cups of tea, I told her everything, not in the trembling tones of someone seeking sympathy, but in the calm, deliberate way you might recount the details of a case, laying out the facts as they are. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly on the table, the faintest smile playing at the corner of her mouth, as though she could already see the outlines of an answer. When I finished, she leaned in, lowering her voice, and said, "You have more power here than you think, Margaret. We just need to put it in the right place." What followed was an education in quiet strategy. She explained how I could place my property into a trust, securing it in a way that would prevent any rash decisions or unwanted interference, while also opening possibilities for income. She scribbled notes on a napkin, drawing boxes and arrows, her handwriting as decisive as her voice. And I felt the first spark of something I had not felt in a long time. Momentum. By the time the second pot of tea arrived, we were discussing ways to generate passive income, ideas I had never considered because I had been so focused on simply preserving what I had. Eleanor spoke of tenants, small-scale investments, even an arrangement with a local business owner who might rent the unused portion of my garden for seasonal produce. Each suggestion felt like a door quietly unlocking in my mind. She smiled fully then, the kind of smile that comes from seeing the pieces of a puzzle begin to fit, and said, "You don't need to fight head-on, Margaret. You just need to build a position so solid no one can push you out of it." As we parted, she pressed the napkin into my hand like a contract, and I walked home with it, tucked safely in my coat pocket, the ink already smudged from my fingers, but the plan clear in my mind. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with Eleanor's notes beside me, I felt the first true shift in my thinking. I was no longer only guarding what was mine. I was planting something that could grow, quietly and steadily, until it became the foundation for whatever came next. The guest house had been sitting at the edge of my garden for years, a squat little brick building with ivy curling up one side, and a roof that sighed under the weight of moss, used mostly for storing boxes I had not opened in decades. One crisp morning, with Eleanor's napkin of notes still pinned to the notice board in my kitchen, I walked out there with a mug of tea in my hand and the sudden, certain thought that it was time to turn it into something that could work for me. The key was stiff in the lock. The hinges groaned when I pushed the door open, and the air inside smelled faintly of dust and cedar. Over the next few weeks, I cleared it from corner to corner, sorting through old furniture, forgotten curtains, and the ghosts of other plans that never quite took shape. I hired a handyman for the repairs I could not manage alone, watched as the walls were painted in a pale cream that caught the light, laid down a rug that felt warm underfoot, and set the small kitchen in order until it looked as though it had been waiting for someone to move in all along. When the listing went up for a long-term rental, I expected a trickle of interest, but within days I had a tenant, a quiet school teacher who paid on time and appreciated the little garden path I lined with lavender. That steady rent became the first pillar of something solid under me. At the same time, I dusted off my old bookkeeping skills, the ones that had seen me through decades of office work, and began offering my services online. It started modestly. A few small clients who needed their accounts tidied and invoices tracked. But word spread in the quiet, dependable way it does when you do a job well. Soon, I had enough regular work to fill my mornings, leaving my afternoons free and my evenings unburdened by worry. The first month, I saw the numbers add up. Rent from the guest house, payments from my consultancy. I sat at my kitchen table with my ledger open, running my fingers over the neat columns as though they were something I could hold in my hands. There was a calmness in seeing the figures grow, not wildly but steadily, like water filling a jug, drop by drop. For the first time in years, I did not feel as though my future was balanced on someone else's goodwill. I could make decisions without asking permission, pay for repairs without rehearsing an apology, and plan ahead without that thin thread of dread running through every calculation. Standing in the doorway of the guest house one evening, the scent of lavender drifting up from the path, I realized I had not only turned a key in the lock, but in myself, opening a room I had forgotten was there, one that held control, purpose, and the quiet thrill of knowing I could shape my life again. It was a damp November afternoon when the phone rang, the kind of day where the sky feels pressed low over the rooftops and the air smells faintly of rain. I had been in the middle of reconciling a client's accounts. my pencil poised above the ledger, when I saw Daniel's name flashing on the screen. There was an urgency in the way he said my name, a tightness in his voice that I had not heard since he was a boy calling me from the school nurse's office with a fever. He stumbled over the details at first, his words tumbling out in pieces until the shape of it became clear. The business he had been so proud of, the one he said would set him and Marla up for life, had collapsed after a risky investment went sour. The investors had pulled out, the accounts were empty, and now he was behind on the mortgage. Marla was furious. Creditors were calling daily, and the threat of losing their home was no longer just a shadow, but something with weight and teeth. As he spoke, I could picture him pacing in their pristine kitchen, running a hand through his hair, while Marla glared from across the room, her voice sharp in the background. My heart ached in that old, instinctive way, the part of me that still saw him as the boy who scraped his knee and came running to me for comfort. But underneath the ache was the echo of his voice from months earlier, telling me to stop being a burden, each word still etched into me like a scar. I listened quietly, letting him speak, noting how there was no mention of those words now, no distance in his tone, just the rawness of someone backed into a corner. When he finally paused, I asked gently, "What is it you need, Daniel?" There was another silence, heavier this time, and then he said it plainly. Money. Enough to catch up on the mortgage and keep the lights on until they could find their footing again. I looked out the window at the guest house, warm light spilling from its windows where my tenant had just returned home, and thought of the accounts I had been so carefully tending these past months, the independence I had rebuilt brick by brick. The old me might have agreed instantly, rushing to ease his fear without a thought for my own security, but I stayed quiet a moment longer, weighing not just what he was asking, but what it meant. In that pause, I felt the difference between who I had been and who I was becoming. My heart still ached for him, but I would not step back into the role of silent rescuer without remembering how easily he had once cast me aside. That day, I decided that if I helped him, it would be on my terms, not his. I let the silence stretch after Daniel's plea, listening to the faint sound of rain tapping against the window, giving myself the space to think rather than rush in with the reflexive yes that had once defined me. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, almost businesslike, though inside I could feel the old tide of emotion pushing at the edges. I told him I might be able to help, but it would have to be under certain conditions, conditions that protected me as much as they offered him relief. He started to speak, his words tumbling in gratitude, but I stopped him gently and explained that any money I provided would be treated as a loan, formalized in writing, with a clear repayment schedule and interest. I told him I would be the creditor, not a quiet benefactor, and that this was not about punishment, but about ensuring fairness. There was a beat of hesitation on his end, the faint shift of pride bristling, but desperation has a way of drowning out ego, and I could hear it in the way his voice softened when he asked what he needed to do. I told him Eleanor would draft the agreement, her years as an attorney making her more than capable of ensuring every clause was watertight. We would meet in person to sign it, and nothing would be handed over until the ink was dry. I could almost hear him glance toward Marla, as if seeking her counsel, though her voice was muted in the background. When he finally agreed, it was with the weary tone of a man who knew the ground beneath him was giving way and had no choice but to grasp at the hand offered. After we hung up, I called Eleanor and laid out the situation. She did not question my choice to help him, only asked for the details so she could prepare the document. The next day we met at her kitchen table, the scent of fresh coffee curling in the air as she slid the printed pages toward me, each paragraph precise and deliberate. When Daniel arrived that afternoon, his face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered, and for a moment I saw both the man and the boy he had been. He read the agreement in silence, his finger tracing each line, and when he reached the end, he signed without protest. I countersigned, Eleanor witnessed, and the transaction was complete. As I handed him the check, there was no rush of martyr's satisfaction, no swelling of the old maternal instinct, only the steady knowledge that I had offered help without surrendering my boundaries. Watching him leave with the envelope in his hand, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that compassion and self-respect could stand in the same room without either yielding to the other. The check sat on the table between us, the paper crisp, my handwriting neat and deliberate, as though the steadiness of the ink might somehow anchor the instability of the moment. I had written it after double-checking every figure in the repayment agreement Eleanor had drafted, making sure the amount would cover the overdue mortgage payment and the most pressing of the bills Daniel had listed. Nothing more and nothing less. This was not a gesture of indulgence, not the open-handed giving that had once drained me without thought for my own future, but the execution of a formal agreement between two adults, one lending, the other owing. Daniel sat across from me, shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes moving between the check and the legal document that lay beside it, as if absorbing the reality that this was not a rescue offered in the soft, wordless language of a mother's unconditional help, but a transaction with weight and structure. I slid the check toward him, the sound of the paper against the wood far louder in the stillness than it should have been, and he reached for it slowly, his fingertips brushing the edge before lifting it into his hands. He glanced down at it, his jaw tightening, then looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. For a moment, I thought he might try to thank me with the easy confidence he had used in the past, but instead his voice came out low, almost tentative, as he said, "Thank you, Mum." It was simple, but there was something in it that felt different, a crack in the smooth surface of his pride, a fissure that revealed a glimpse of the boy who used to run to me with his scraped knees and wild dreams. I did not let the moment linger. I reminded him of the repayment terms, the dates by which each installment was to be made, and the interest agreed upon. He nodded, not arguing, not sighing, just listening. When he left, the check folded neatly into his wallet. I stayed at the table for a while, staring at the space where it had been, thinking about how many times over the years I had helped him without expecting anything back. This time was different. This time there was a line drawn clearly between what was his and what was mine. A line I would not blur, no matter how the months ahead unfolded. As the light outside dimmed and the kitchen filled with the muted blue of evening, I realized that the money I had given him was not the most important part of what had just happened. What mattered was that I had done it without sacrificing my dignity, that I had offered my help without stepping back into the role of someone whose worth was measured only by what she could give away. The months that followed settled into a rhythm I had never imagined, one where the balance between Daniel and me had shifted so completely that I sometimes caught myself wondering if he noticed the irony at all. At the start of each month, I would sit at my desk in the small front room, open my ledger, and type out a polite but firm reminder email about his repayment schedule, attaching the updated balance sheet that included the interest we had agreed upon. My tone was always professional, no different than the way I addressed my bookkeeping clients, and I made sure to send it at the same time each month, so there could be no excuse about forgetting the terms. The payments came in, sometimes on the exact day, sometimes a day or two late, but they came, and each one was marked neatly in my ledger. the numbers aligning with a precision that gave me a quiet sense of satisfaction. I knew this arrangement was not just about money, it was about boundaries, about the reversal of a dynamic that had once left me feeling small. Now, the son who told me to stop being a burden was the one leaning on my support to keep his life upright. And I was no longer the silent giver who asked for nothing in return. Occasionally, when I sent a reminder, he would call instead of emailing back, his voice lighter than it had been in months, perhaps because paying his debt to me in structured steps was less humiliating than the idea of having taken charity. I did not gloat, and I did not twist the knife, but I could not help noticing the symmetry of it all, the way life had turned the table so gently yet decisively. Once, over tea at my kitchen table, Eleanor laughed softly and said, "Well, Margaret, I'd say the scales are balanced now." I smiled, but said nothing, because in truth, I wasn't sure if balance was the right word. This wasn't revenge, nor was it an act of pettiness. It was a quiet correction, a realignment that allowed me to hold my head higher without hardening my heart entirely. Each month that passed made me more certain that I had done the right thing, not just in helping him, but in doing so on terms that respected my own worth. The irony was never lost on me, though I kept it to myself, a private reminder that sometimes the best way to teach someone the value of what you give is to make them pay it back, not in bitterness, but in steady, accountable steps. And as I watched the balance owed slowly shrink while my own savings and income grew, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years, the kind that comes when you finally stop carrying someone else's weight without them even noticing. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Daniel stopped by, unannounced, the way he used to before there were walls between us. The autumn light slanted through the kitchen window, pooling in soft gold on the table where I had been peeling apples for a pie, the air rich with the scent of cinnamon and pastry. He sat down without me needing to offer, his hands clasped together loosely on the table, as if he were holding something invisible but fragile. At first, the conversation drifted over safe topics, the weather, a match he had watched the night before, a passing mention of work. But there was a restlessness in the way his eyes kept flicking to mine and then away again. Finally, after a silence that seemed to stretch longer than it should, he cleared his throat and said, "Mum, I owe you an apology." The words came out stiff, as if they had been waiting in him for too long, and my instinct was to wave them off, to keep things easy. But something in his voice stopped me. He spoke haltingly at first, the sentences uneven, as though each one had to be dug up from somewhere deep. He admitted he had not realized, truly realized, how much I had done for him over the years, how much of myself I had poured into making sure he had the life he wanted. He said he had taken it for granted, assuming my sacrifices were simply part of the air we breathed, never stopping to see the shape of them until life had shown him what it meant to stand on unsteady ground. I listened quietly, my hands resting on the table, the apples forgotten beside me, and as he spoke, I caught something in his expression that I had not seen in years. It was a flicker, small but unmistakable, of the boy who once came to me with every triumph and every scrape, who believed I could set the world right with nothing more than my attention and care. There was no arrogance in his voice now, no edge of dismissal, only the kind of humility that comes when a person has been brought low enough to see clearly. When he finished, he held my gaze for a moment longer than usual, and in that pause, I felt something loosen between us, not entirely repaired, but no longer pulled so tight it might snap. I told him I appreciated his words, and I meant it, though I did not reach for the comfort of saying it was all forgotten. Instead, I let the moment be what it was, A rare truth laid bare between us, fragile and real. As he left later, the kitchen felt warmer somehow, the kind of warmth that does not come from the oven, but from the smallest shift in the air when understanding finally begins to grow. The day Daniel brought the final repayment check was bright and cold, the kind of winter morning where the air feels thin and sharp, and the sunlight catches on every frost-edged branch. He arrived with no fanfare, just a knock at the door and the faint crunch of his shoes on the path. And when I opened it, there was a calmness in his face I had not seen in some time. We moved into the kitchen, the same kitchen where months earlier he had told me to stop being a burden, and the memory of that moment flickered briefly before settling into the background. I put the kettle on, the hiss and hum of it filling the quiet as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table between us, and though it was only paper, it felt heavier than it should have, carrying with it the weight of every conversation, every reminder, every careful line I had drawn since this began. I opened it slowly, the check inside crisp and final, the amount written out in his neat, deliberate handwriting. For a moment, I simply looked at it, letting the reality of it settle in. This chapter between us was closing, not with anger or distance, but with the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. I set the check aside and poured the tea, the steam curling upward in soft ribbons. He thanked me then, his voice low but steady, and it was not the polite, almost perfunctory gratitude of someone fulfilling an obligation. There was something warmer in it, something that carried the weight of recognition. His eyes held mine, and in them I saw not the defensive distance that had marked so many of our recent years, but a softness, a quiet acknowledgement that went deeper than words. We spoke of ordinary things over our tea, the weather, a recipe I had tried, his plans for the weekend. Yet beneath it all was the knowledge that the ground between us had shifted. There was no need to say that this had changed us both, that I had learned to stand in my own strength, and he had learned what it meant to lean without taking. When he left, the envelope tucked back into my records, I stood for a moment in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around the warm cup, and let the stillness wash over me. The table where we had once sat on opposite sides of a painful divide now felt like neutral ground, and in that quiet, I realized it was not just the debt that had been repaid, but something older, something that had been waiting years for balance. In the weeks after Daniel's final payment, I found myself returning often to the kitchen table in the early mornings, a cup of tea steaming gently beside me, and the first pale light of day spilling across the surface. It had become my place of quiet reckoning, where I could lay out not just figures on a page, but the less tangible sums of what I had gained and what I had let go. I realized, as I sat there, that the truest balance sheet of my life was not held in bank accounts or trust documents, though those now stood strong and steady, but in the boundaries I had learned to set and keep. For so long, I had measured my worth in what I could give without expectation, in the endless acts of quiet sacrifice that I assumed were the proof of my love. Now I understood that love could still flow, and perhaps flow more purely when it was offered without erasing myself in the process. Financial independence, I had learned, was not just about the security of knowing I could meet my needs without turning to anyone else. It was about the dignity of making choices on my own terms, the confidence that no one's care for me could be poisoned by the weight of obligation. I thought about Daniel often, not with the tight ache that had once accompanied his name, but with a calmer kind of acceptance. I could forgive him, not because his words had not hurt, they had, but because holding on to that wound would have kept me tethered to a version of myself I no longer wished to be. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a gift I was giving him so much as a quiet release. I was granting myself a way to walk forward without the constant drag of resentment. I continued to tend to the small empire I had built for myself. The guest house bringing in steady rent, my consultancy keeping my mind sharp and my accounts full. Small investments that grew quietly in the background, like seedlings in well-turned soil. Each decision I made was a reaffirmation of the promise I had carved into the core of myself. I would never again let anyone, even my own son, make me feel like I was a burden for simply existing. The life I had now was not the one I had imagined in my younger years, but it was one I had shaped with my own hands, through persistence, careful choices, and the slow reclaiming of my own worth. As the sun climbed higher and the tea in my cup cooled, I closed the ledger, not because the work was finished, but because for the first time in a long while, the numbers and the woman who kept them were exactly where they needed to be.